Manitoba High School, and he has been working on understanding the microstructure hardness relationship of coated Inconel 617.
Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the research I've done here for the past month on a material called Inconel 617. We have a growing energy problem today in that we need a new, clean, reliable source of energy that is carbon dioxide emission free, that can take on the growing demand of the future generations to come. And I believe that Generation 4 nuclear reactors can do just that. These reactors claim to be 100 to 300 times more fuel efficient than current reactors employed today. They claim to be able to consume nuclear waste in the production of electricity, and the nuclear waste that is left over lasts only decades compared to the previous millennia. The only problem is that these reactors are about 20 years away from production, and there are many material challenges that accompany these guidelines for the future. So that's where I come in. My material, Inconel 617, is a nickel-based superalloy that is a candidate for a heat exchanger in a Generation 4 nuclear reactor. Here is a schematic of a nuclear reactor where the chain reaction occurs in here, and the heat is transferred into this coolant, which flows on into the second vessel known as the heat exchanger. And this is where Inconel 617 would be the primary material. The heat is then dissipated into a second coolant, which goes further on into the production of electricity. And why Inconel 617 is such a great candidate is because it is extremely strong and durable. The only problem is that it suffers from corrosion. So to combat this corrosion, we'll be coating our samples of Inconel with several alloys. Here is one of our samples with Inconel 617 on the bottom, composed mainly of nickel, chromium, cobalt, molybdenum, and aluminum. And on top of Inconel, we will be aluminizing our sample with something called NiAl, nickel alumini, composed mainly of nickel and aluminum. And on top of the NiAl, we'll be bonding on a substance called Phe, composed of iron, chromium, aluminum, and yttrium. And what we're concerned with is how this microstructure changes due to processes like interdiffusion. Interdiffusion is basically when elements from one substance diffuse into that of another, changing the microstructure and its properties. So here is a heat-treated sample of Inconel, and if we zoom in on the Phe layer right here, we can see these tiny small precipitates start to form due to interdiffusion. And we don't really know, or we didn't really know, how that would change the hardness or other mechanical properties. So what I have done is I've been measuring the hardness of Inconel when coated with these two alloys, because the hardness will give us insight into some of the mechanical properties of our sample. And how I've been measuring the hardness is by using a device called a microindenter, which will make indents in a sample using a diamond tip. Here is the microindenter that I used throughout my project, with an optical microscope on the left, the load control just up here, and the indenter hiding beneath its container. And in order to make indents, all you need to do is focus your sample under the optical microscope, swivel the indenter over on top of the sample, and release the lever until an impression is made in your sample. And once I had all of my indents, I took them to another optical microscope to measure the diameters. And here is one of the indents I made in the Phe layer, with an average diagonal of around 80 microns or so. And what we can do with that is, if we know both the load used to make the indent and the indent's diagonal's length, we can plug those into the Vickers hardness equation, HV, and we will be given a result in kilogram force per millimeter squared. So what I did when I had all of my hardness measurements is I plotted the hardness of each indent against the depth into the sample of where the resulting indents are. And it gave us a pretty good idea of what the hardness was for each individual layer. And what this graph shows us is that the Phe layer indents are a lot stronger than that of Inconel. And we were a little confused because we thought the opposite would occur. And we have two hypotheses for this phenomenon. One, in that microindentation is perhaps too large for the phi Crowley layer, and some of our indents were getting too close to the epoxy resin layer over here, or the NIAL layer right here, therefore giving us inaccurate hardness ratings. And two, brings us back to that process of interdiffusion. And as you can see, some of our heat-treated samples in pink and green are given larger hardness ratings than that of the blue indents, which have no heat treatment. And we think this is because of the precipitates that occur due to interdiffusion after heat treatment. We think that they're actually making the material stronger. And next, the NIAL region, which has no indents simply because it's too small for microindentation. And then in between the NIAL region and the Inconel region is a small layer called the interdiffusion zone, where elements have accumulated due to interdiffusion from the Inconel region and the NIAL region. And you can see that here they have a slightly higher concentration of hardness due to an increased concentration of aluminum. And lastly, the Inconel 617 layer has a Vickers hardness of around 200 to 225. So what we learned from these results were that these small precipitates were forming in the phi Crowley layer upon interdiffusion, and that these precipitates were actually strengthening the material as a whole rather than weakening it. But upon continued interdiffusion for longer periods of heat treatment and time, these precipitates slowly started to dissolve, weakening the material once again, and that is a major concern for us if this material with its coating is ever to be used in an application such as the heat exchanger. In future research that can be conducted with Inconel 617 is that of nano-indentation, which could give us more accurate results of hardness in the NIAL and phi Crowley layers. Creep strength testing, which is basically high temperature permanent deformation testing, which would give us more insight into some of the other mechanical properties of Inconel. And lastly, my mentor, Betsy Clark, is working on identifying all the precipitates that form an Inconel 617 and their effect on the microstructure evolution of the material. Now, I learned a lot from this program, but the most important thing I came away from it was that if I make my goals, I can set out to achieve them. And I came into this program knowing next to nothing about material science and what it entailed. And through hard work, determination, and persistence, I learned the terminology, I learned all about my project, and I learned what material science has to hold. And I know now that if I really want to set my goals, and I do, I can achieve what I set out to get. I would like to thank some of the people for making this research possible. My mentor, Betsy Clark, for being flexible and helping me with everything I needed or she saw fit. And without her, I would not be able to have gotten anywhere in material science or in this project, let alone. My advisor, Carlos Levy, who let me work in his lab, and I am very thankful for that. Derek, Pete, and Kirk, who helped me become acquainted with some of the devices in a college research laboratory. And the whole Apprentice researcher staff for giving me the opportunity to further my affinity for science. I would also like to thank some of the funders, the Department of Energy, CNSI, and CSEP for making this whole program, my mentor, and my research possible. Thank you.